Good evening, everybody. My name is Esther Tyler and I'm the chair of the Trobe University Art History chapter. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome you to the 23rd Annual Ray Alexander Lecture. This lecture falls during NAIDOC week, for which the theme is Always Was, Always Will Be. So it's especially appropriate then that as part of La Trobe University, we proudly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where its campuses are located in Victoria. We recognise that Indigenous Australians have an ongoing connection to the land, and we value their unique contribution both to the university and to the wider Australian society. This series of lectures was named in honour of Ray Alexander, who was the first president of the Art History Alumni. Normally, this event takes place in the Clemenger Auditorium of the NGV, and for obvious reasons, this couldn't happen this year. So we're very grateful to our Alumni Advancement Officer, Ronnie Baird, for all of the work she's done to make it possible to Zoom this lecture into your living rooms. This year, we have a record number of over 200 attendees demonstrating the real interest in the community in visual art. And I would like to thank those of you who took the opportunity of donating to our scholarship fund. This event has so far raised over $500 towards this fund. At present, we provide awards to a first-year art history student and to a third or honours visual arts student in the creative arts program. And I know that we can all remember how valuable this recognition and monetary help can be for a young or early career student. I'm sad to say that once again, art history and creative arts are the subject of review at La Trobe University and have an uncertain future. It's understandable that universities face a difficult situation at the time, but it is nevertheless devastating that once again, it seems that the real contribution the humanities make to society is undervalued. But let's move on from that. And tonight we're gathered here to celebrate and to benefit from the work of our colleague and our friend, Dr. Vincent Alessi. And we very much appreciate Vince's willingness to share his research. Dr. Frank Heckes will introduce Vince. Frank is a member of our committee and an honorary research associate at La Trobe University. And many of you will know him from his 27 years of lecturing in art history at La Trobe. Frank is a scholar and an author in Spanish art, 1500 to 2000, in particular Goya, and Dutch and Flemish painting, 1500 to 1700, in particular Bruegel. So please sit back, enjoy the evening, and thank you, Frank.
Good evening, everyone. I have a great pleasure tonight of introducing Vincent Alessi, who is one of our best art history students at La Trobe University. He completed his Bachelor of Art with honors in art history in 2000 and his PhD in art history in 2010, both at La Trobe. And since 2015, he's been a senior lecturer in the Department of Creative Arts and English at La Trobe. Since I've known Vince, he has been interested in the life and work of Vincent Van Gogh. His other research interests include mid to late 19th century European art, 19th century popular graphic illustration, and Australian contemporary visual art and curatorial practice. He has held numerous positions within cultural institutions, including as artistic director of La Trobe University Museum of Art, known as LUMA, director of a curatorial manager at the Ian Potter Museum of Art at the University of Melbourne. And he's curated many exhibitions, both nationally and internationally, on artists as diverse as Mike Brown, Philip Hunter, Juan Ford, Julie Rapp, Brooke Andrew, and many others. And on topics varying from abstractionism in Australian landscape painting to notions of place and identity in contemporary practice. Since 2019, Vince has been the founding director and curator of the Connors Gallery in Fitzroy, which will be reopening next week for all of you who want to attend. Vince has numerous publications, and I want to mention especially two of them. His article, Herkomer's Drawing and Engraving on Wood in Van Gogh, published in the July 2020 edition of the Burlington Magazine, and Vince's book, in part based on his PhD thesis, recently published by Monash University Publishing in Melbourne, and entitled Popular Art, this is the book, Popular Art and the Avant-garde, Vincent Van Gogh's Newspaper and Magazine Prints. This is a brilliant study, and it reveals how Van Gogh's collection of black and white prints shaped his art throughout his career and opens up new understandings of a body of works that thematically and stylistically continually fascinated and inspired him. We will now hear our Vincent speak about another Vincent's famous early work, The Potato Eaters. The title of the lecture is The Threads Have Been Chosen Carefully and According to Certain Rules, Problems and Solutions in Vincent Van Gogh's Potato Eaters. Over to Vince.
Thank you, Frank. It's a great pleasure and somewhat daunting for me to present this evening. As Frank mentioned, I'm an alumnus and studied art history at La Trobe, and in many ways I still feel as if I'm a student and my lecturers are in the auditorium this evening. So I do want to take this opportunity to thank all those lecturers who inspired me and ensured I had the grounding and the education to get where I am now. And it's a real pleasure for me to almost come full circle and be able to present this evening. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We will be able to have Q&A at the end of the evening. In order to participate in that, you will need to just type your questions into the little Q&A tab, which you would see at the bottom of your webinar screen. And we will try and answer those, as many of those questions at the end of the evening. I too would like to acknowledge that I this evening am presenting on the Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So in early March 1885, Theo Van Gogh wrote to his brother Vincent asking if he had a work which he wished to enter in the French Salon. Van Gogh acknowledged the positive sentiment and Theo's enthusiasm for wanting to promote his work, but resisted, declaring, "If I'd known it 6 weeks earlier, I would have tried to send you something for this purpose, but that for now he didn't have anything that he would care to send." His focus at the time was his project of painting a large body of portraits, heads only, and while they were important, they were, in Van Gogh's words, studies in the true meaning of the word, that is, they're meant for the studio. Later in this letter, Van Gogh returned to the idea of what he may have sent, a woman spinning or spooling yarn full length, which would be an extension of his painted head series. At the end of March, Van Gogh wrote to Theo again, returning to his continuing project of painting heads, and discussed that he was now thinking of how to expand on this work in a grander composition. While not being overtly specific, Van Gogh does suggest that such a composition would consist of a group of figures sending a sketch in the letter to provide Theo with a visual reference. It is, he wrote, for example, something like this, namely figures against the light from a window. I have studies of heads for it, both against the light and facing the light, and I've already worked on the whole figure several times, seamstress winding yarn or peeling potatoes, full face and in profile. I don't know whether I'll get it finished though, because it's a difficult effect. Still, I think I've learned a few things from it. The smaller of the sketches, on the right-hand side of the page, shows two heads against a window during the day, their activity unseen to the viewer. In the distance, through the window, Van Gogh reverts to a common motif used during this period, a church on the horizon line, a symbolic reference to his view of the piety of the rural class. This is the first indication of what a new work culminating out of months of studies might look like. Half-length figures, peasants resting at home and not active in the fields, and a clear religious sentiment. Soon after this letter, Van Gogh sent a number of urgent telegrams to Theo, advising him to return home urgently. Their father had suffered a stroke, and he would die a few days later. It was during this short period together, where the brothers were gathered in the family home, that the initial discussions about the potato eaters took place. What was discussed is not known. However, Van Gogh's letter of the 6th of April clearly indicates that Theo was aware of his plans. He wrote, "I plan to make a start this week on that thing with the peasants around a dish of potatoes in the evening, or perhaps I'll make a daylight of it, or both, or neither one, you'll say. But should it succeed or should it fail, I'm going to start on the studies for the different figures." The idea of a daylight scene correlates with the idea in the aforementioned sketch, where the peasant women are sitting by the window. The plan to depict them around a dish of potatoes was a logical choice. Potatoes were the staple diet of the peasants of the Brabant region where Van Gogh was living and working. Moreover, the subject of a peasant family sitting and eating around a table was common at the time. It was far from anything new or revolutionary. It was a popular theme in European art at the time and had been the subject of a number of paintings by the Hague artist Joseph Israels, an artist whom Van Gogh knew and admired. Van Gogh mostly knew this painting here, Frugal Meal of 1876, which had gained the painter a high reputation abroad and in the Netherlands, at a time when Van Gogh had entered the picture trade. The subject remained popular in the Netherlands and from the mid-1880s on, as can be seen by the works of a number of local, now minor artists, such as this work by Albert Newhels, Bernard Blommers, and Bernard de Hogg. The Potato Eaters was Van Gogh's first great genre painting, and the climax of his work in the Netherlands. It was of utmost importance as Van Gogh wished to, in the words of Louis van Tilburg, prove himself to the world after 5 years of study. It was a painting that was to come to define the artist's Dutch years. It was a crescendo of not only the years of practice and endless studies, but also a culmination of the many influences which had shaped Van Gogh's view of what constituted an artist and art itself. The great painter of peasants, Jean-Francois Millet, the colorist Eugène Delacroix, the master English black and white illustrators, literary greats such as Charles Dickens, and of course, his belief in the spiritual existing in nature and the humble worker. In this lecture this evening, I want to discuss the development of this now iconic painting, revealing how it developed from a number of drawings to a number of oil studies and ultimately culminating in the work now displayed permanently in Amsterdam in the museum that bears the artist's name. I will discuss the many iterations of the work and demonstrate the influences that helped shape it and assisted resolving the issues he encountered throughout its development. In particular, I want to show how Van Gogh's collection of black and white illustrations, the subject of my recent book, aided in rectifying a number of compositional problems. Throughout, my aim is to demonstrate that while The Potato Eaters is not the most technically successful or aesthetically pleasing work of Van Gogh's oeuvre, it remains of utmost significance in its ambition and consolidation of ideas that would allow Van Gogh to push ahead to make the striking and innovative works of the French period. I want to go back a little to provide some context of some of the influences that Van Gogh was drawing on, which explains why his first attempt at a major painting, conceived to be shown publicly and perhaps at the Salon, was something as conservative as a dark peasant painting. When we consider what was happening in Paris at the time, particularly the work of the Impressionists, we can see how Van Gogh's thinking and knowledge were still firmly grounded in the work he had surrounded himself with as a young man, working for the high-profile art gallery and dealer of prints, Goupil & Co. When Van Gogh first set out on his artistic career in 1880, after the disastrous failure of becoming a pastor, he turned immediately to one of his artistic heroes to begin his training. Writing to Theo a month after acknowledging his failures and pleading for understanding that he could do something positive with his life, he asked Theo to send copies of Millet's The Labourers of the Field so that he could continue copying and developing his drawing craft. He had already finished a copy of Millet's Soa, an extremely accomplished drawing for someone who had just decided to try his hand as an artist. His choice of subject matter and artist speaks volumes to the kind of artist which Van Gogh aspired to be. He saw himself carrying on the work of Millet and those of the Barbizon school, depicting the peasants conducting their daily activities. His first painting teacher was his cousin by marriage Anton Wavre, a leader of the Hague School of Painters, a Dutch version of the Barbizon school. Throughout the next 5 years, Van Gogh would focus on making works that aligned with this peasant and rural genre, aesthetically dominated by an overt sombre colour palette. There were endless studies of peasants in the fields, and when he finally began painting, he attempted a number of large horizontal compositions, such as the Potato Diggers of 1893 and the Ploughmen of 1883 also. Both of these works reveal Van Gogh's intent to become a painter of peasants, the former painting also clearly showing that he had yet acquired the skill to make anything so complex. Van Gogh saw in such subjects the true aim of art, which was, as Van Tilburg notes, to express the human spirit. Van Tilburg suggests that while Van Gogh had made a tentative effort to do so in past figure drawings, such as works like The Bearers of the Burden Worn Out or At Eternity's Gate, the Potato Eaters marked his first attempt to achieve this goal in a painting. While he gave this painting a rather didactic title, his depiction of a peasant mill, Van Tilburg claims, was a comparable statement on the human condition. In Van Gogh's view, the artistic quality of the work lay not in its technical form, but in his frank and sincere portrayal of the lives of country people. Prior to attempting the Potato Eaters, Van Gogh had mentioned that he had been working on portraits, essentially studies of heads. This was Van Gogh's second attempt at making a series of such heads, the first conceived and executed while he was living in The Hague and consisting solely of drawings. This series of over 40 works were predominantly paintings, and as mentioned by the artist, were studies for the studio that might lead to something more complex. The idea of making such a series had its genesis in Van Gogh's collection of black and white newspaper prints, a collection of over 2,000 prints cut from the newspapers such as the Illustrated London News and the Graphic. It was the latter newspaper, the Graphic, that over a 10-year period produced a series known as Heads of the People. These works did not depict individuals, but rather universal types, such as a miner, a labourer, and a coastguardsman. We know that Van Gogh's own series was inspired by these prints. He wrote often about the influence of the graphic illustrations, including using the title Heads of the People, written in English, to describe the initial Hague series. His head studies in Newnan, prior to the development of the Potato Eaters, are essential in understanding this painting. Without the studies, Van Gogh could not have conceived, let alone execute, this grand genre painting. The Potato Eaters is an extension of these head studies, particularly in its conceptual framework. It is not a painting of an identifiable family with their own history, relationships, and issues relating to their daily grind. It is not set in one particular home and household. Instead, like the Heads of the People series and peasant paintings of past masters such as Millet, it is a depiction of a universal type. This family represents all the Brabant peasants. This interior stands for all of the cottages that were dotted around the countryside. This painting depicts the essence of the local peasants, honestly and without a hint of celebration. Van Gogh's print collection was central to his work at this time, and it was a significant resource for the Potato Eaters beyond the Heads of the People series. As a fundamentally self-taught artist, he attended an academy only briefly and received some advice and training from peers. His collection of prints was central to his education. Black and white popular prints influenced everything from subject matter to style for Van Gogh. They helped him realise the importance of contour lines, the power of strong lines against negative backgrounds, and how to set up, as Hans Luton has argued, composition and create mood. They also assisted on occasions in helping to resolve works in development, the potato eaters being a case in point. In this context, they informed the notion of portraits as depictions of types, reaffirmed alongside artists like Millet, the continued relevance of depicting peasants and the working class, and as will be shown later, aided in resolving complex problems of composition encountered throughout the development of the work, from drawing to oil sketch to final painting. The potato eaters developed in various manifestations, first as chalk sketches and then in oil, beginning as a sketch and concluding with the Amsterdam painting. This was not unusual for Van Gogh, who throughout his career reworked scenes before settling on a definitive version. Describing the lengthy and sometimes troubling process in realising the final canvas, Van Gogh wrote, and I quote, "Although I'll have painted the actual painting in a relatively short time, and largely from memory, it's taken a while. It's taken a whole winter painting studies of heads and hands. And as for the few days in which I've painted it now, it's consequently been a formidable fight, but one for which I have great enthusiasm. Although at times I feared that it wouldn't come off, the painting is also act and create." Continuing, drawing on an analogy of another community of labourers, the weavers of the local region, he confirms that I've had the threads of this fabric in my hands the whole winter long and reached for the definitive pattern, and is now a fabric that has a rough and coarse look. Nevertheless, the threads were chosen with care and in accordance with certain rules. The initial sketches of the potato eaters reveal Van Gogh's aim of having 4 peasants at a table, eating from a central dish. The first chalk sketch from March-April shows the figures hunched over, all leaning in towards a central point, the location of the communal dish of hot potatoes. Above this scratch is a detail of a hand holding a utensil, with which to prick a potato from the communal bowl. Shortly after this, Van Gogh produced another chalk sketch, revealing his plan for a more open composition. It was also the first indication that he had rejected the idea of showing the peasants having a midday meal in front of a window. In this section, Van Gogh enclosed them in this sketch, Van Gogh enclosed them in an interior space and introduces the suspended ceiling lamp, a detail that will remain constant throughout the work's multiple manifestations. Van Gogh obviously intended the bowl of potatoes to be a key component of the composition, and as such placed the table on an angle in both sketches with a clear sight line to the dish. He also aimed to have the faces of each peasant clearly visible by seating them in a more upright position, an obvious decision considering he had made endless studies of heads. Like the suspended lamp, this was a feature that would remain consistent throughout the development of the painting. Soon after executing these black chalk sketches, Van Gogh launched into his first oil sketch of the composition. It is important to reassert here that this was not deemed a painting by Van Gogh, and as such should not be viewed than anything other than an experiment and trial for what was to come. Developing on from the chalk sketches, Van Gogh rearranged the figures again, closing off the earlier open space on the table and partially obscuring the dish of potatoes. An outcome of this reordering was the creation of a halo effect around the central figure, the silhouetted peasant facing away from the viewer in front of the rising steam, and was perhaps a deliberate act to emphasise the pious qualities which Van Gogh prescribed to the working and peasant class. The figure, however, suffered from a lack of shape and definition. It is block-like and dark in comparison to the other figures and lacks any sense of animation. It does not seem to be participating in the meal in any immediate sense. Van Gogh continued to make studies of heads and also preparatory drawings of key elements of the painting, such as the teapot, plate, and objects, which would ultimately find their place on the wall on the right-hand side of the final painting. A few weeks later, he created a new painting, this time larger and with a more serious intent, establishing what would be the basis of the final painting. In a letter on the 9th of April, he included a letter sketch, writing to Theo, "See, this is what the composition has now become. I've painted it on a fairly large canvas, and as the sketch is now, I believe there's life in it." He also, at the end of this letter, suggests that Theo show the sketch to the journal Le Chat Noir, a satirical weekly newspaper which featured modern arts and literature, and which Van Gogh probably hoped would accept an illustration of the potato eaters. In this new and more detailed version, Van Gogh introduced an additional figure, expanding the scene to 5 peasants in total, 4 adults and a young girl. This change not only dramatically altered the composition, it also created new problems with the central figure of the young girl. The 4 visible adult figures had previously modelled for Van Gogh, part of his Head series, and he was therefore able to use them to assist with their depiction. However, this figure of the young girl was drawn from the imagination and positioned so as to create a harmonious balance in the composition. As in the earlier oil sketch, Van Gogh faced the figure away from the viewer, turning her to the left to create a sight line towards the potatoes. However, the weakness in this painting, and obviously in the previous oil sketch, is the figure's silhouetted appearance, which gives the impression of a cutout figure rather than an animated fleshy human. The silhouetted body and the head are block-like shapes with no impression of a rounded and sculpted face. In addition, there is no allusion to a relationship between this figure and the other peasants. Van Gogh remains somewhat frustrated with the slow progress, writing to Theo again on the 13th of April. He writes, "I haven't been able to work it up as far as has been my intention. I painted 3 days continuously from early till late, and by Saturday evening, the paint started to get into a state that didn't allow further work, unless it's completely dry first." Van Gogh would in due course relinquish any further work on this version, and in time would begin on a new and once again larger canvas, which would become the final and completed version of the potato eaters. However, before doing so, he took the unusual step of making a lithograph of the yet to be completed work, advising Theo that this venture was private and not for publication, even for Le Chat Noir. This lithograph was not proclaiming the success of the composition, as Van Tilburg argues, but instead it was to announce that the final painting was soon to follow, and indicating Van Gogh's confidence in the success of the final version. The slightly larger and final version of the Potato Eaters is more finished and benefited from Van Gogh's numerous trials in the previous work, as he struggled to resolve a balanced and ambitious opus. This dedication is in ensuring that the final work would be his first grand public statement. Van Gogh followed his lithograph with multiple drawn and painted studies of hands, teapots, and cups. He remained relentless in pursuit of producing a work that in all its detail expressed his aim of creating works that spoke to the piety of those who worked the land. Sra van Houten declares that this small collection of studies of hands reveals Van Gogh's intention, and I quote, to exploit the expressive power of his potato eaters, not only through his subjects' faces, but through their hands as well. In these drawings and painted studies, Van Houten argues, Van Gogh aimed to heighten the expressiveness of knotty, rugged hands and thus strengthen the image of peasants who toiled with their hands. Although essentially the same as the previous painting, the final version includes a number of alterations. The 2 figures on the right were placed closer together, and the woman pouring the coffee was turned towards the viewer, exposing additional cups. The troubling central figure was also amended. Returning to the concept in the original oil study, Van Gogh placed the figure in front of the rising steam. More importantly, the figure's head had become more sculpted and the cheeks more rounded, catching the warm glow of the centrally hanging light. Van Tilburg has commented that this figure of the young girl, and I quote, would be difficult to identify from any specific precedent. We can now see the precedent, however, lies buried in Van Gogh's collection of black and white prints. Of all the existing prints from Van Gogh's collection, only one has evidence of a trace mark on its reverse, J. Knight's Chris Ferrum, the Blacksmith of Loxley Green. The trace mark is only around the head, shoulder and upper arm of the right figure, suggesting that Van Gogh may have used this print in order to resolve the many problems that the central figure in the Potato Eaters had caused. It would be logical for Van Gogh to refer to an image in his vast print collection to resolve compositional issues, but also for conceptual guidance. We've already seen this in the influence of the Heads of the People series, and it can be found also in his first and only commission of drawings made while he was in The Hague. In this series, rather than depicting famous buildings in the city, as was requested by the commissioner, his uncle Cor, Van Gogh decided to depict scenes of industrialisation and the everyday staples of the illustrated newspaper content. In both Van Gogh's painting and Knight's illustration, the setting is an interior lit by a central light source, a lamp in the painting and molten metal in the print. The light that falls on the face and upper body of Van Gogh's figure replicates the traced area of the worker in the print. The young girl's cheekbone is more pronounced and reflects the light, as does the neck and the shoulder, and a soft glow highlights her upper arm. The size of the two figures, Van Gogh's figure and the figure in Knight's print, is also very similar, further indicating the possibility that Van Gogh may have transferred the image directly onto the canvas. More probable, however, is that Van Gogh referred to this print when applying final touches to the canvas. An X-ray photograph of the Potato Eaters reveals where Van Gogh added final touches, so that is any area where you see these white marks. And it is of no surprise that this includes highlighting the young girl's cheek and shoulder. When we consider the importance of this work and the difficulty posed by this figure throughout the composition's development, it is understandable why Van Gogh would have turned to his print collection for assistance, an aid that he had used on many previous occasions. It seems that Van Gogh referred to a further print in his collection to assist with the overall construction of the final composition, and also in justifying his pursuit of making a true peasant painting. In a letter sent just after the completion of the second canvas, Van Gogh argues his position of focusing on being a peasant painter, even though the public's interest in such work was waning. He, of course, places Millet at the centre of his discussion. He writes, and I quote at length, "When I say that I'm a peasant painter, that is really so, and will become clearer to you in the future. I feel at home there, and it's not for nothing that I've spent so many evenings sitting pondering by the fire with the miners and the peat cutters and the weavers and peasants here, unless I had no time to think. Because of the work, I've become so absorbed in peasant life by continually seeing it at all hours of the day that I really hardly ever think of anything else. You write that the public mood, that is, indifference to Millet's work, as you just had the opportunity to see that exhibition, isn't encouraging either for the artist or for those who have to sell paintings. I agree, but Millet himself felt and knew that, and on reading Sensia, which was Millet's biographer, what he said about the start of his career struck me so much that although I don't remember it literally, I remember the sense of it, that is, that indifference would be bad enough for me if I needed fine shoes and the life of a gentleman, but because I go around in clogs, I shall manage, and that's how it turned out. So what I hope not to forget is that it's a question of going around in clogs, that is, of being content as regards food, drink, clothes, sleep, and what the peasants are content with." To place the argument in a more contemporary context, Van Gogh writes how other artists such as Belgium's Xavier Mellery are again making works today that has this sentiment. He declares that he had recently seen but not collected an illustration by Mellery in a newspaper. He writes, "A barge's family in the little deck house on the barge, husband, wife, children around a table." This work aesthetically is quite different to the Potato Eaters. It is light, very open, and the focus is on the young child, the centre of attention. However, there are compositional parallels, such as the interior setting, the division of space, the inclusion of everyday objects to indicate the role and status of the family, and of course, a focus on the figures. While Van Gogh did not own a copy of this illustration, and that he may have only seen it in passing, he had in his collection an English equivalent, W.B. Murray's Canal Life, Tea Time on a Monkey Boat. Van Gogh knew his collection intimately, and Murray's illustration may have reminded him of this similar work to which he had easy access, of which there are obvious similarities. Strong parallels between the final version of the Potato Eaters and Murray's print suggest that Van Gogh used compositional rules from Canal Life, Tea Time on a Monkey Boat in order to make adjustments to the final painting. The interior space, drastically developed and altered from Van Gogh's first chalk and oil sketches, reveals how in the main it is a construction of Van Gogh's imagination, rather than a faithful reproduction of the interior of a typical regional cottage. The height of the room in the Potato Eaters is much lower than would have been normal in the region's workers' cottage, one of the major changes from the very first oil sketch. The device helped frame the figures, emphasising the crowded environment in which they were succumbed to live, and provided the possibility to create an atmosphere where the light reflects off the ceiling and the walls. The beams lining the ceiling move away from the viewer to give a sense of perspective, not an accurate representation of reality, while two strong diagonals at the top corners of both images create an arch-like effect over the respective group. On the right side of Van Gogh's painting, the female figure sits in an alcove, closed off by a strong vertical beam. This is similar to the husband and wife in Murray's print. The empty space found in the bottom right-hand corner of the painting was filled with an object adding balance to the composition. Again, a device found in the print. Both images include various hanging objects, suggesting the modest belongings the families owned and the limited space they had to store them. Other similarities include the offering of the cups, the emphasis on the faces, only half-length and three-quarter-length figures, and a young girl standing in a central position. While Van Gogh drew on many sources to complete this work, it would be fair to say that it does not have the finesse nor the technical maturity of other works. From a craft point of view, it is far from a Millet or an Israel's, and its refinement does not even reach the standard seen in Murray's print. This was strongly put to Van Gogh by his peer and close friend at the time, Anton van Ruppert, after he received a copy of the lithograph of the Potato Eaters. He wrote boldly, criticising Van Gogh's work. He wrote, "I hoped, and I still hope, that I'm mistaken in my opinion of your manner of working. But for this very reason, I'm really sorry to see in you what you've now sent me, so complete a confirmation of my opinion that I myself was shocked by it. You'll agree with me that such work isn't intended seriously. You can do better than this, fortunately, but why then observe and treat everything so superficially? Why not study the movements? Now they're posing. That coquettish little hand of that woman at the back, how untrue. And what connection is there between the coffee pot, the table, and the hand lying on top of the handle? What's the pot doing, for that matter? It isn't standing, it isn't being held, but what then? And why may the man on the right not have a knee or a belly or lungs? Or are they in his back? And why must his arm be a metre too short? And why must he lack half of his nose? And why must the woman on the left have a sort of little pipe stem with a cube on it for a nose? And with such a manner of working, you dare to invoke the names of Millet and Breton. Come on, art is too important, it seems to me, to be treated so cavalierly." This criticism undoubtedly hurt Van Gogh deeply, evident in his response to Van Ruppert, which I quote here in full. "My dear friend Ruppert, I just received your letter to my surprise. You hereby get it back. Sincerely, Vincent." For Van Gogh, Van Rapper had failed to recognise the key element of the work, not its technical refinement, but its conceptual message. The criticism of the work was levelled by others, and Van Gogh felt he needed to fully articulate his meaning and intention of the work, and of course this was done for Theo. He writes, "I really have wanted to make it so that people get the idea that these folk, who are eating their potatoes by the light of their little lamp, have tilled the earth themselves with these hands they are putting in the dish. And so it speaks of manual labour, and that they have honestly earned their food. I wanted it to give the idea of a wholly different way of life from ours, civilised people. So I certainly don't want everyone just to admire it or approve it without knowing why." And then he writes, "One would be wrong, to my mind, to give a peasant painting a certain conventional smoothness. If a peasant painting smells of bacon, smoke, potato steam, fine, that's not unhealthy. If a stable smells of manure, very well, that's what a stable's for. If the field has an odour of ripe wheat or potatoes, or guano or manure, that's really healthy, particularly for city folk. They get something useful out of a painting like this. But a peasant painting mustn't become perfumed." Van Gogh clearly wanted the work to articulate the experience of those who live in harmony with nature on the land, in a physical and conceptual sense. His aesthetic choices were made consciously and purposefully, and did actually have their genesis in Millet's approach, whose biographer, Alfred Sensier, which Van Gogh read. Sensier notes that Millet painted his peasants in the colours of the earth which they sowed. Above all else, it was that the conceptual reading for Van Gogh, which was the most important element of this work. This painting was undoubtedly a painting about the peasants, which could be read in a spiritual sense. As workers in the field, they sowed the land to give life, a biblical connotation in Van Gogh's first major drawing of the sower. They were humble and uncivilized, but just like the Sunday labourer in the Heads of the People series, they had the fortitude to read the Bible, emphasising their piety. Van Gogh's painting also speaks to the generational practice of the peasantry. Once a peasant, always a peasant. The painting includes the old, the middle-aged, and the young. This is the life cycle for these humble workers of the land. Such an idea, like many that inform Van Gogh's practice, is evident in his black and white print collection. It was a trope that was seen often, including in images that are in Van Gogh's collection of an old woman comforting a newly widowed young wife after an expected mining explosion. This is their light, their lot and expectation in life. The work also speaks to notions of family and the idea that exists in the writing of one of Van Gogh's favourite authors, Charles Dickens. In The Old Curiosity Shop, Dickens writes, "Those which link the poor man to his humble hearth are of the truer metal and bear the stamp of heaven. His household gods are of flesh and blood, with no alloy of silver, gold, or precious stone. He has no property but in the affection of his own heart, and when they endear bare floors and walls, despite of rags and toil and scanty fare, that man has his love of home from God, and his rude hut becomes a solemn place." Michael Slater, the eminent Dickens scholar, suggests that Dickens had a deeply held lifelong belief in the sacred nature of home, and that the notion of home can be seen, and I quote, "in the emphasis on the provision of food as one of the two essentials, the other, warmth, the fire brightly burning on the hearth." Alexander Walsh extends this argument about the centrality of home for Dickens, arguing in his City of Dickens that it was, and I quote, "the heavenly city brought down to earth." These similarities, both visually and conceptually with the Potato Eaters, could not be any closer. While the Potato Eaters was derided by many of Van Gogh's peers, it was a major milestone in his career. It is not one of Van Gogh's magisterial, colour-rich and innovative canvases from his later years, but it was the gateway for them. The Potato Eaters brought together the many threads which Van Gogh had been weaving together in the first 5 years of his career. It took a leap of faith by him to attempt something so ambitious, and while it is far from pleasing to the eye, it allowed him to bring together everything that was of interest, that he believed constituted art, and that he deeply felt was the essence of his being as an artist. It is, as Ronald Delua, a previous director of the Van Gogh Museum, has declared, the undisputed masterwork of Van Gogh's Noonan period, marking the accomplishment of the artist's cherished ambition to produce a well-constructed figure piece in the peasant genre, which would measure up to the work of Millet. It is also a work that demonstrates that Van Gogh was not some mad genius producing works from the imagination without a purposeful framework. The development of this work reveals that Van Gogh worked systematically in developing both his craft and making considered technical and conceptual decisions. Nothing for Van Gogh happened by chance. In the last few years of his life, in the last few months of his life, Van Gogh returned to the Potato Eaters, making a number of sketches for a potentially reimagined version. The drawings reveal that he still believed in the basic composition of the work, but with the possibility of setting it during the day as he had originally planned. However, nothing was to come of this. Van Gogh died a few months after these sketches were completed. The Potato Eaters remained of central importance to both the artist and the Van Gogh family. It was one of the few Dutch period paintings which his sister-in-law, Johanna, who inherited all of Van Gogh's works after the death of her husband, Vincent's brother and lifelong supporter Theo, she was reluctant to sell. It hung above the mantelpiece in numerous of Van Gogh residences, first in Theo's apartment and then in Johanna's numerous homes. When the work passed on to Johanna's son, named Vincent after his uncle, it likewise hung above the family fireplace. Its importance for Van Gogh himself is clearly evident. Even after Van Gogh left the Netherlands and his dark palette behind and produced some of the most revolutionary works of late 19th century European art, the Potato Eaters remained special for him. What I think of my work, he wrote to his sister Wilhelmine, is that the painting of the peasants eating potatoes that I did in Noonan is, after all, the best thing I ever did. Thank you. So we still have about 12 minutes. And so if anyone has questions, you can type those into your Q&A bar and I will address those for you. The awkwardness of Zoom. Oh no, what have we got here? Just a thank you. Thank you, Michelle. There's a fantastic comment from Penny at the Van Gogh Museum when I was there. I think it said Vincent was not good at legs. Probably not, but I think what's really key for the Potato Eaters is that it is, it was always intended to be a picture which focused on the faces, on the heads, of which Van Gogh was working so diligently for over months. So that's one of the key reasons that these are all 3/4 length and half length figures. So the question is, do we know how long it actually took Van Gogh to produce the final version? Not very long, just a matter of weeks actually. So from the time he finished the second version and then made a number of preparatory drawings, he started on the major version. And the delays were, at one point he actually takes the painting to a friend to store for 3 days because he didn't want to actually tackle the work while it was still wet, which was one of the issues with the second painting. It became too muddy to work with. So it sort of sat there for a few days, and then Vincent went, picked up the work and touched it up. But he does write to Theo that it actually is executed quite quickly, if we consider that 2 weeks is an actual quick turnaround. A question from Mike: did Van Gogh see Millet's work in person or just black and white reproductions? He did see Van Gogh's work in person. So when he was young, a young art dealer, he did see the works while he was in The Hague and also in Amsterdam. He did see a rather large exhibition, admittedly, of drawings and prints by Millet, and he writes that how it was such a spiritual experience, telling Theo that people should have taken their shoes off before entering such a space. So he was quite familiar through those networks. Sorry, just working through these questions. Vincent, is there a hint of the later Impressionist period in these early works? I think one of the things, and the Van Gogh Museum have done extensive research on this painting, and had also in the mid-90s, they did actually try to conserve this work, and what they found was that they were only able to remove the initial layer of varnish. So it is still a rather dark painting, but we do know that one of the driving influences on this work was Eugene Delacroix, and his use of blue against, using blue and yellow to create a dark aesthetic, a sort of a black without using black. Van Gogh at this stage was still really didn't have an idea of what the Impressionists were doing. He knew about them through Theo, but he hadn't seen any work. And in many ways, actually, was dismissing what they were doing, because he still believed that the works of artists like Millet and Rembrandt and Delacroix were the kind of works he was aspiring to. So the painting is dark, but there are hints of Van Gogh adapting a more colourful palette. Of course, it becomes completely different when he gets to Paris, and he does have the opportunity to meet, and I suppose more importantly, speak with the Impressionists firsthand, where he was able to get a much greater sense of what they were doing. Brooke has mentioned, conservation. So yes, so it has been conserved, but it is still relatively dark. All indications and the research of the Van Gogh Museum, they presume it was somewhat lighter than it currently is, but they came to a decision that it was just too risky to remove any further layers of varnish, that it would actually damage the work. So, but it is no longer as dark as it once was. So Tim, was coffee not too expensive for the peasants at the time? It was, and they're actually not drinking coffee, they're drinking chicory, and that was for the main reason, is that they couldn't actually afford coffee. So a staple diet was potatoes and chicory instead of coffee. So from Bronwyn, family and in particular Theo was really important to his practice. Can you elaborate a little bit on this relationship? I think it's indisputable that without Theo, we don't have Vincent. Not only did Theo provide the endless resources, financial, paint, but he was Vincent's great solace. And did an amazing job. If you read some of the letters, Vincent could get quite nasty, and Theo was constantly there. The only time they really had a major breakup was while Vincent was rambling around the Borinage mining district of Belgium while he was trying to become an evangelist, and he lost contact with Theo. But once he started painting, they were in contact constantly. Vincent was writing sometimes as often as once a day. So not only does he support Vincent in that way, and I said financially, but he does try really hard to promote Vincent's work in Paris. And of course, we know that Vincent only sells one painting, but I think what gets lost often in that discussion is that he exchanged a lot of paintings. So Theo was speaking to particularly the Impressionists, and they were able to exchange paintings. They understood what Vincent was doing. And I said, I don't think we have Vincent without Theo. We definitely don't have Vincent without Johanna. And there is a book that has just come out, unfortunately only in Dutch at the moment, but it tells the story of Johanna. And it's quite clear that she could have quite easily, after Theo passed away, 6 months after Vincent passed away, she could have quite easily just, you know, got rid of all those paintings. But she took it upon herself to do two major things. One was to realise Theo's legacy, which was that Vincent would become a known artist. And the second, I think, really, really integral legacy is that she sorted out the letters and made them available. It took a long time before they became available, but without those letters, we don't really have the intimate knowledge we have. And so if it wasn't really for Theo and Johanna, who were the sort of bastions of and supporters of Vincent, the rest of the family, in many ways, entertained him. Vincent had a relatively close relationship with his younger sister, Wilhelmine, and he would write to her about art the same way he would write to Theo. But his Theo's mother, who outlived her son, both of her sons never really thought anything of the work, didn't think they were too interesting or valuable. So she didn't receive many works, but we presume she probably disposed of them. But yeah, Theo is central, is a central player. And some of my research is actually looking at this notion of home as a sort of conceptual framework for Van Gogh, particularly in the context of Charles Dickens as well. Graham asks, what are the dimensions? It's a very good question, Graham. Just bear with me and I will get those for you.